Welcome back to part 2 of the series on Australian female serial killers. We remain in the 1800s in the first case, the Black Widow of Richmond, Martha Needle, after which there are no further records of female serial killers until the late 1900s. That's not to say that there were no more of these guilty femme fatales for almost 100 years. Many more may simply have slipped through the cracks and gone undetected. Let's begin. Martha was one of 6 children, born at Julia Creek near Kapunda in South Australia. Her parents fought constantly, and Martha's mother often accused her husband of trying to poison her. Her mother described Martha as cruel and headstrong, and also accused Martha of threatening her life and inciting her half-brother to join in her plan. At the age of 12, Martha was sent to North Adelaide and put to work for a Mrs. Drew, where she was raped by the time she was 13 years old. In 1892, Martha met and married Harry Needle, who was a carpenter and some years older than her. The couple had 3 children: Mabel, born 1882, Elsie, born 1883, and May, born 1886. They moved to Melbourne shortly after May's birth, and for the first few years lived in Cubitt Street, Richmond. They appeared happy in each other's company, and friends described them as a well-matched couple. But over time, Martha began to go out more often without her husband, and by all accounts, Henry became jealous and morose. On the 28th of February, 1885, Mabel, 6 years old, became ill and eventually died. Henry Needle went to Sydney in search of better employment, with no luck, and on his return the relationship further deteriorated. A few months later, Henry fell ill. His condition quickly grew worse because he refused to accept food or drink from his wife. Anything she offered was refused, sometimes thrown on the floor or against the wall in anger. He never gave a reason for this, but friends who helped Martha in his nursing believed it was due to being hot-tempered and frustrated by his illness. The effects were disastrous, and he eventually died. The attending doctor wrote the cause of death as subacute hepatitis, enteric fever, and exhaustion. A sum of £60 was paid to Martha as 1/3 share of Henry's £200 life insurance. The balance was invested for their 2 remaining children. On the 9th of December 1890, Elsie, now 6 years old, fell ill and died a few weeks later. The cause was listed as acute gangrenous stomatitis. Martha received just over £60 as Elsie's share of the life insurance. On the 27th of August 1891, May died of tubercular meningitis. She was 4 years and 11 months old. In a very odd twist, Martha had spent most of the insurance money on an elaborate grave for her family, which she would visit almost every day. In January 1892, Martha became housekeeper for Otto and Lewis Junkin at Bridge Road in Richmond. Lewis was a saddler, and the brothers had come to Melbourne from Lyndoch in South Australia. In April that year, Martha and Otto became engaged, but Lewis objected to his brother marrying someone who could exhibit such frightful outbursts of temper and rage. The Junkins' mother also sent a letter from South Australia objecting to the marriage on the grounds of Martha's weak health. On the 18th of August 1893, Lewis fell ill. It lasted for almost 2 weeks, but when he consented to his brother's marriage, he suddenly recovered. But 8 months later, in April of 1894, the violent vomiting symptoms returned. A relative travelled from South Australia to nurse him, and he made a full recovery. On the night the relative returned to South Australia, May 10th, Martha Needle went to a shop and purchased a box of Rough on Rats. The following morning she prepared breakfast, and Lewis once again fell ill. This time he died, and the death was recorded as inflammation of the stomach and membranes of the heart. The Junkins' mother arrived with another brother, Herman. Again she refused to agree to Otto marrying Martha, and was this time backed by Herman. Of course, it wasn't long before Herman also fell sick. Luckily, a new doctor who had attended to Lewis was sharper than his predecessors and sent samples of Herman's vomit for testing. When it revealed traces of arsenic, the police were contacted and a trap was set. The following morning, when Martha offered Herman a cup of tea, he literally blew a whistle and police barged in. Martha tried to empty the cup onto the floor, but a young officer made a saving dive. It contained 10 grams of arsenic, enough to kill 5 people. Martha was arrested, and the bodies of Henry Needle and 2 of their children were exhumed. Mabel had been dead too long to allow for any analysis. Detectives also exhumed the body of Lewis Junkin from his grave in Lyndoch, South Australia. It contained 34 grams of arsenic. After a 4-day trial before Justice Hodges at the Melbourne Criminal Court, Martha Needle was pronounced guilty and condemned to death. During her time in prison, one newspaper wrote, "None of those in contact with Martha can fathom her character. The condemned woman's mask of reserve has baffled even the prison's governor." The government medical officer and both of his spiritual advisors described the woman as inscrutable as the Sphinx. Martha's only reference to the murder of her husband, 3 children and future brother-in-law was an unfaltering statement that she was completely innocent and a conviction that she would go to heaven. Otto Junkin stuck by Martha throughout the trial, and her will, made 5 days before her execution, read, "I give, devise and bequeath all my real and personal property to Otto Junkin of Bridge Road, Richmond, for his own absolute use." Martha Needle was executed at 8 a.m. on the 22nd of October 1894. When asked for any last words, she answered, "I have nothing to say." Needle was the 3rd of 4 women hanged at the old Melbourne jail. Kathleen Folbigg was born on the 14th of June 1967. In 1969, her father, Thomas Britton, murdered her mother, Kathleen Sr., stabbing her 24 times in a violent rage. Kathleen was made a ward of the state and placed into foster care after her father's arrest. She dropped out of school when she was 15 years old, and with limited education and resources, worked at low-paying jobs to get by. In 1987, she married Craig Folbigg, a steel worker, and they resided in Mayfield, near Newcastle in New South Wales. A son, Caleb Gibson Folbigg, was born a healthy baby on the 1st of February 1989. Caleb was diagnosed by a paediatrician as suffering from a condition which caused a lazy larynx, meaning he would breathe rather noisily, but it was something he would eventually outgrow. On the 20th of February 1989, Folbigg stated that she had put Caleb to sleep in a room adjoining her bedroom. She attended to Caleb during the night, hearing him stir around midnight, and said he was restless until 2 a.m. At approximately 2:50 a.m, Craig Folbig was awoken by his wife's screams. When he ran to Caleb's room, he saw Kathleen standing over the crib screaming, "My baby, something is wrong with my baby." Caleb was thought to have died of sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. He was 19 days old. Just over a year later, on June 3, 1990, Patrick Allen Folbig was born, another healthy baby. Craig Folbig took leave from work to help care for his wife and baby for 3 months after the birth. On the 18th of October 1990, Folbig put Patrick to bed. He was again woken by the sounds of his wife screaming, and again to see his wife standing over their baby's cot. He checked Patrick and noticed that he wasn't breathing, and managed to revive him by cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Patrick was later diagnosed with epilepsy and cortical blindness. On the 18th of February 1991, Craig Folbig received a call from his wife saying, "It's happened again." An autopsy found that little Patrick's cause of death was acute asphyxiating event resulting from an epileptic fit. Patrick was 8 months old. Following Patrick's death, the Folbigs moved to Thornton, a town northwest of Newcastle. On the 14th of October 1992, Sarah Kathleen Folbig was born. All seemed well until the following September, when Sarah caught a cold and was having trouble sleeping. By 1:30 a.m. the next morning, Sarah was dead. Police records state that Craig Folbig was again awoken by his wife's screams and looked up to find her standing in the doorway of their bedroom. When Craig went to check Sarah, she was lying in her bed, motionless. The 10-month-old death was officially attributed to sudden infant death syndrome. After Sarah's death, the Folbigs moved to Singleton in the Hunter Valley, north of Newcastle. Laura Elizabeth Folbig was born on the 7th of August 1997. Laura was apparently healthy when Folbig brought her home 3 days later. Given the history with Folbig's other children, Laura's breathing and sleep patterns were monitored closely for several weeks after her birth, just to be sure. All was well until 19 months later, when Laura caught a cold. On the 1st of March 1999, Folbig called an ambulance after Laura allegedly stopped breathing. According to the medical report, 2 ambulance officers arrived to find Kathleen performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation on her daughter on the kitchen bench. They took over and examined Laura to find that she was not breathing and had no pulse. As before, an autopsy was conducted, but unlike the others, the coroner considered Laura too old to have succumbed to sudden infant death syndrome. He recorded the cause of death as undetermined and ordered a police investigation. Detective Sergeant Bernard Ryan was assigned to investigate Laura's death. Sadly, cot death is a reality, and Ryan could have viewed the case as just that. But given the coroner's findings, he was thorough enough to consider all possibilities. Ryan interviewed Kathleen and Craig Folbig, only to learn that Laura was the 4th child to have died in a similar way. His suspicion grew. After Laura's death, Kathleen left her husband and abruptly moved away. Not taking many of her possessions with her, Craig was left to clean up her belongings and made an unpleasant discovery. In Kathleen's bedside drawer, he found her diaries. The contents, he later told the court, made him want to vomit. He immediately took the diaries to the police. Detective Ryan learned that Kathleen had been keeping diaries for most of her life. Many of her entries are indicative of a woman torn by mixed emotions. She wrote about her wild mood swings and how she watched fish swim in a tank to try and calm herself. She wrote of her innermost fear, that Craig would leave her. An entry on the 13th of November 1996 indicated the isolation she felt, even from her own family. Other entries seemed more sinister. She wrote how stress made her do terrible things and spoke of flashes of rage, resentment and hatred toward her children. One particular entry on June 11th, 1997 reads, "My brain has too much happening, stored but unrecalled memories just waiting. Heaven help the day they surface and I recall. That will be the day to lock me up and throw away the key. Something I'm sure will happen one day." On the 21st of May 2003, in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Kathleen Folbig was found guilty on 3 counts of murder, 1 count of manslaughter, and 1 count of maliciously inflicting grievous bodily harm. On the 24th of October 2003, she was sentenced to 40 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 30 years. After an appeal in 2005, the court reduced her sentence to 30 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 25 years. In August last year, 2018, following a petition by Folbig's supporters to have her convictions reviewed, the New South Wales Government agreed to a judicial review, and hearings were held in March and May this year. Craig Folbig stood silently, remaining passive as he heard 2.5 days of evidence by his former wife, in which she repeatedly denied that certain entries of her infamous diaries alluded to her having killed her children. She repeatedly told the inquiry she believed that a supernatural power had killed all of the children. New South Wales Attorney General Mark Speakman announced, "I agree with the findings and decisions made pre-trial, during the trial and on appeal. It remains that the only conclusion reasonably open is that someone intentionally caused harm to the children, and smothering was the obvious method. The evidence points to no other person than Kathleen Folbig." Folbig resides in protective custody to prevent possible violence by other inmates. Catherine was born on the 23rd of May 1951. At the age of 12, she met David Burney, and by the age of 14, she was in a relationship with him. Her father begged Catherine on several occasions to leave David due to the fact that she was often getting in trouble with the local police. But his disapproval of their relationship only strengthened their union. Her time in prison throughout her adolescent years offered Catherine a chance to break away from David. Encouraged by a parole officer, Catherine began working for the McLaughlin family as a housekeeper. She married Donald McLaughlin on her 21st birthday. She and McLaughlin had 7 children. But in 1985, she left her husband and children and went to live with David Burney. The couple were never legally married, but Catherine changed her surname by deed poll to Burney. From October 6, 1986, this is what happened over the space of just 5 weeks. 22-year-old Mary Nielsen was studying psychology at the University of Western Australia and working part-time in a delicatessen when she met David Burney at a spare parts yard he worked for. David offered to sell her cheap tyres for her car and subsequently gave her his phone number. On the 6th of October 1986, she went to Bernie's house. There she was gagged, chained to the bed and raped by David while Catherine watched. She was taken to Gleneagles National Park near Albany Highway in Bedfordale, where she was raped again and strangled with a nylon cord. Bernie then stabbed her, thinking that it would speed up the decomposition, as he'd read that in a book somewhere, and they buried her in a shallow grave. 2 weeks after the murder of Mary Nielsen, they abducted 15-year-old Susanna Candy. She was hitchhiking along Stirling Highway in Claremont, Western Australia. Susanna was an outstanding student at Hollywood Senior High School and lived at home with her parents and siblings in Nedlands. Her father is one of the top ophthalmic surgeons in Western Australia. After she went missing, the Bernies forced her to send letters to her family to assure them that she was all right, but the family feared for her life. The Bernies had been cruising for hours looking for a victim when they spotted Candy. Once she entered the car, she was held at knife point and her hands were tied together. She was taken back to their Morehouse Street house in Willagee, where she was gagged, chained to the bed and raped. After Bernie had finished raping the girl, Catherine Bernie got into the bed with them. She knew that this turned David on. When they had both assaulted her, Bernie tried to strangle the girl with the nylon cord, but she became hysterical and went berserk. The Bernies forced sleeping pills down her throat to calm her. Once Candy was asleep, David put the cord around her neck and told Catherine to prove her undying love for him by murdering the girl. Catherine complied. When asked later why she did it, Catherine said, "Because I wanted to see how strong I was within myself. I didn't feel a thing. It was like I expected. I was prepared to follow David to the end of the earth and do anything to see that his desires were satisfied." On the 1st of November, they saw 31-year-old Nolene Patterson standing beside her car on the Canning Highway. She had run out of fuel while on her way home from a job as bar manager at the Nedlands Golf Club. Once inside the car, she had a knife held to her throat, was tied up and told not to move. She was taken back to Morehouse Street, where, gagged and chained to the bed, David repeatedly raped her. The Bernies originally decided to murder her that same night, but David kept her prisoner in the house for 3 days. There were signs that he had developed an emotional attachment to Nolene. Catherine quickly became jealous and made an ultimatum. David would kill Patterson, or Catherine would kill herself. He immediately forced an overdose of sleeping pills down Nolene's throat and strangled her while she slept. They took the body to the forest, but this time buried it away from the others. Catherine reportedly got great pleasure from throwing sand on Patterson's face. On the 5th of November, the Bernies abducted 21-year-old Denise Brown as she was waiting for a bus on Stirling Highway. She accepted a ride from them and at knife point was taken to the house at Willagee, chained to the bed and raped. The following afternoon, Denise was taken to the pine plantation. In the seclusion of the forest, David Bernie raped her in the car while the couple waited for darkness. As they dragged Denise from the car, David Bernie raped her again and stabbed her in the neck. Convinced that the girl was dead, they dug a shallow grave and laid her body in it. But Denise suddenly sat up in the grave. David Bernie then grabbed an axe, struck her twice in the head, and buried her in the grave. 17-year-old Kate Moyer would be their final abductee and the only victim to survive. Kate was abducted at knife point after accepting a ride from the Bernies. She would later state that she asked them if they intended to kill or rape her and was informed, "If you're good, we'll only rape you." David held a knife to her throat and forced her to call her mother. Kate told her mother that she'd had too much to drink and was staying at a friend's house, hoping that her mother would catch on, knowing she was not a drinker. She was forced to dance for them and slept in the couple's bed while handcuffed to David. Kate feared she would be murdered and managed to make a drawing and hide it in the bedroom so that someone might eventually know that she'd been there. One morning, after David went to work, Catherine went to the front door to carry out a drug deal and forgot to chain Kate to the bed. Kate broke the lock on a window and climbed through, making her escape. Wearing only a black singlet and underpants, Kate desperately knocked on neighbours' doors with no answer. She jumped a gate and was attacked by a dog but managed to flee, and eventually ran into a vacuum cleaner's shop. Hysterical, she informed the shop owner that she had been raped. When the police arrived, she explained that she had been abducted at knife point by a couple who had taken her back to their house and raped her. The police were initially sceptical of her story. In those first critical hours, only one person believed her, a rookie officer not much older than the teen and only months out of the police academy. 22-year-old Constable Laura Hancock said the amount of detail Kate provided convinced her that the teenager was telling the truth. Kate had paid attention to minute details, telling the officer that the movie Rocky was in the VCR, Dire Straits was in the cassette player, and although her captives used false names in front of her, she remembered a name she saw on a medicine bottle as David Burney. Kate told the young officer she had drawn pictures and hidden them in the house so that someone would know she had been there. Hancock left the room to plead the teenager's case with her senior colleagues. It wasn't until David Burney, who had a lengthy criminal record by that stage, was mentioned that major crime police were called in and took over. Subsequently, the police found Kate's drawing in the home on Morehouse Street, as well as the VHS copy of Rocky in the VCR. David and Catherine were arrested. During their interviews, they gave conflicting information. Catherine denied ever meeting Moyer, while David insisted she had come to their house voluntarily to engage in consensual sex. Hours of grilling David Burney had proved unsuccessful, but a gamble by Detective Sergeant Vince Cattage paid off when he told Burney they'd best get a shovel and dig up the graves. The weasel-like Burney caved to the bluff and added to the detective's shock by admitting that there were 4 graves. The Burneys then led police to the graves of Mary Nielsen, Susanna Candy, Nolene Patterson and Denise Brown. When sent to trial, David Burney pled guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 each of abduction and rape. He was sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment. Catherine Burney was also sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment by the Supreme Court of Western Australia. Under the law at that time, both were required to serve 20 years before being eligible for parole. Initially, David was held at the maximum security Fremantle prison, but he was soon moved to solitary confinement to keep him from coming to harm from other prisoners. The original death row cells were converted for him and he stayed there until the prison was closed in 1990. While incarcerated, the Burneys exchanged more than 2,600 letters, but were not allowed any other form of contact. David Burney was found dead in his cell at Casuarina Prison on the 7th of October 2005. He was 54 years old. An inquest found that he had hanged himself from an air vent using a length of cord. Catherine was not allowed to attend his funeral. Catherine Burney is imprisoned in Bandiup Women's Prison. In 2007, her parole application was rejected, and then Attorney General of Western Australia, Jim McGuinty, said that her release was unlikely while he remained in office. Her case was to be reviewed again in January 2010. However, on the 14th of March 2009, new Western Australian Attorney General Christian Porter, following requests from the victims' families, determined she would stay in jail for life. That decision makes her the third Australian woman, after Catherine Knight and Patricia Byers, to have her papers marked never to be released. Kate Moyer, the Burney's final victim who survived, began a campaign to end Western Australian laws that automatically put convicts up for parole every 3 years. In 2017, Catherine's youngest son, Peter, called for her execution. He stated that his association with Burney has resulted in his being assaulted numerous times. Kate Moyer and Constable Laura Hancock were reunited more than 3 decades later for their first interview together. They believe they will now remain friends for life. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more murder, mystery and mayhem. Until next time.